Hello everyone, and welcome to another of our Leadership Series webinars. My name is Dr. Donald Chick, and I am the founder and CEO of New Synergist Consulting. We provide a variety of strategy, leadership development, diversity and inclusion, and data analytics to our clients. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss a very important component of leadership, and that is decision making. During this webinar, we're going to discuss four main topics. One, we're going to provide a definition of sorts so we all understand what decision making is. Secondly, we're going to talk about the impacts of decisions, both good and bad. Third, we're going to discuss some decision making processes. And then finally, we're going to discuss how we can improve our decision making and thus become better leaders. Before we get started, I would like to say a couple words in terms of expectations for this webinar. While we're talking about decision making, we're not going to spend much time talking about some of the tools you might use. And I'm talking about quantitative tools. Tools like return on investment or other types of financial analysis, or process tools like Lean Six Sigma. Now those tools are critical, and where appropriate you should be using them. However, one of the things I want you to remember is those tools are available to support your decisions. You should not be making decisions solely based on those tools. And we'll talk some more about the art and science of decision making as we move forward. So what is decision making? Well, simply put, it's the act of selecting one alternative from a set of alternatives. Now, one key point to remember when you think about that part of the definition is deciding not to decide is in fact a decision, because one alternative is always to do nothing or to not make a decision. But that in effect is a decision. So first we have to decide that a decision needs to be made, and then decide how to select from the alternatives that we have in front of us. One of the problems some people may have with decision making is what you might call the classical model of decision making. We decide a decision needs to be made. We proceed to gather all possible information, make sure the data is perfect, the information is perfect, the alternatives we looked at are perfect, and then making a decision that's in the best interest of the organization or for us personally. Well, that begs the question, how perfect is any information? Because things are changing as we speak, and in this turbulent world, it's difficult to get enough information and make the right decision, even when that information may be changing, is likely changing. In addition, when you say in the best interest of the organization, which parts of the organization? Based on what criteria? Based on what information? So we need to go a little deeper than that and start to think about some of the factors that may impact decision we've gathered or information we may not have. So now we want to discuss the overriding components of making a decision. And it's called the what, so what, now what model. And the what is what's important. Where is your focus? What's the criteria you're using to make a decision? Who are the stakeholders? Who will be impacted? How risky is the decision? How much will it cost? Do I have enough money to implement this decision? Do I have other resources needed to make it happen? Remember, and this first component is where a lot of people already put themselves in a position of likely making a poor decision. Remember, the things you're focusing on, the things that you deem important, go a long way to determining the alternatives you'll look at, which then define the decisions that are possible based on those alternatives, based on that criteria. So don't allow yourself not to think about the what when that's so important. So for instance, if you are working in an organization and you're being pressed for time, and you get a message that the leader of your organization is watching this project, and he or she is laser focused on delivering this project on time. Now, what has that done to your focus? It's likely making you think, I need to watch the time. Are we falling behind? How can I catch up if we are? How can I make sure we don't fall behind more? Or if we're already on schedule, how do I make sure that we stay on schedule? So when that happens, what might happen to the way you're treating employees? What might happen to the way you look at quality? What might happen to the way you're looking at the budget? Remember, the focus, which may seem to be, or might be, on time, on time, on time. So we want to make sure when we are making decisions, we understand the what. It is so critical because it will help determine what decisions are made or not made. So even before you get to looking at alternatives and looking at other information that might be available, you have likely already constrained yourself by defining your what too narrowly. And another thing before we go on, I'd like to mention this decision-making discussion we're having has a focus on the organization, but you can really use some of the things we're talking about, or all of the things we're talking about, on a personal level. So think about that. What is your focus? What's important? And how is it helping or hurting your ability to make good, sound decisions? The next part of that model is the so what. Okay, I'm confronted with a problem. It may be someone else's problem. It may not really be a problem at all. It may be the most important problem confronting me at this moment in time. That's the so what. And each of us in a leadership position has to determine if the so what is actually credible. What might be urgent to some might not be so urgent to me or my organization. And depending on where you are as a leader in the organization, that's why these discussions are so important. We need to understand the so what. There's a big argument over there about a project people are working on. All of those people work for me. Now the so what is, that's how they work out problems. Or the so what might be, this is going to cause this project to be delayed because the team isn't getting along. Maybe the criteria hasn't been agreed on. Maybe they, for whatever reason or reasons, don't like each other, so they're not working well together. You can see how the so whats can be different in that analysis. So we need to make sure we understand the so whats. Then finally, it's the now what. Based on understanding where my focus is and what I've deemed important and the criteria I'm using for a particular decision and making sure it's accurate based on the outcomes that I'm looking for. And for instance, I talked about a project where a very senior leader is saying, I want to make sure that's done on time, even though he or she may not have said, I want to make sure we don't have any mishaps. We see it right there on the board that talks about the principles or values of our organization, and safety's number one. So have we deemed that safety's not important on this project? Well, of course not. But if we're not careful, we can allow our focus to shift in such a way that at least for a period of time, we forget about safety. So with the now what, now we need to look at the alternatives and make some good decisions. And if you only focus on that narrowness of that memo from the senior leader of your organization that says, make sure this project is done on time, you may forget about opening up your aperture and thinking, what about safety, for instance? So the now what derives from the what and the so what, but the now what is where you're actually making and implementing decisions. In some cases, the correct decision is simply not to intervene. I'll delegate it. In other cases, I need to change course. But what we need to do when we get to the now what is that we've taken care of those first two steps, the what and the so what, in a manner which allows the now what to be pretty easy in many cases if you think about it. That's the prep. That's why when we talk about timely decisions, that doesn't mean every decision is made today. That doesn't mean we need to wait 2 weeks to make every decision. It depends on the criteria we're using. And that's literally what we're going to talk about during the rest of this webinar. How do we make sure we're understanding that process and the criteria that needs to be used? Even though I'm sure we all understand how impactful decisions are, I want to go over several examples from an organizational and an individual level just to remind ourselves of how impactful they can be and continue to think about that what, so what, now what model. The first example I'd like to use is the Apple computer example. Well, now actually Apple Inc. because as Apple would say, we don't just make computers anymore. When Steve Jobs, one of the co-founders, came back to run Apple, one of the first, if not the first decision he had to make, by the way, was how to stop burning cash. What should we be doing next? And one of the things he did, he grouped all the products and services into categories. And he chose 4 categories that he felt Apple should focus on. Now that meant discontinuing some products. And of course, in organizations, there's some vice president or senior level manager whose livelihood is based in part around that product. So he or she is likely to fight that. But from a leadership perspective, you have to define the criteria which allows you to make a go, no-go decision. So for instance, one of the things Steve Jobs knew for sure is Apple did not have the resources to continue all of the products and services that they had at that point in time. So you have to make choices. And part of that criteria is, where are we competitive? What can we afford to do? Where can we create a product that gives us a competitive advantage against even larger companies, like a Microsoft, for instance? Where do we need to make strategic alliances so we can get ourselves together financially so we can continue to grow? Otherwise, we're likely to file for bankruptcy and maybe go out of business totally. Now, he had a lot of pushback when he made these decisions, but he stayed the course because his criteria was looking at the long-term success of Apple and not deluding himself into believing in some cases his company could compete with some of the other companies that were out there being competitive. So even though the iPhone was a great decision and obviously a great success, it's likely that the most important decision he made upon his return at Apple was to focus on 4 distinct product lines and discontinue everything else. One of the products he discontinued, by the way, was a precursor to the iPad. I still have that product in my house. And it works even today, except for the battery. Now, was it as good as today's iPad? No, the technology has grown significantly. But a lot of times, what we forget about decisions is they can be temporary. So I don't know this for sure, but I often wonder that they say, you know, this iPad idea is a great idea. We don't have the resources to really sink the R&D dollars that we need to make it a competitive and profitable product today, but maybe sometime tomorrow. Another example is Kodak. Kodak invented the digital sensor. At the time they invented this sensor, they were also dominating the chemical photography market. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of market share was Kodak. So that means they had a pretty big stake in chemical photography. And again, a lot of individual leaders and managers and workers in that company had a stake in the chemical photography market. So imagine this digital photography group with almost no revenues to speak of. They got this new invention. They need money to grow. Where are they going to get it? They're going to get it from the profit makers. But those folks that are making the profit in chemical photography are saying, hey, wait a minute. We need to be spending that money on R&D for chemical photography, because even though we have the lead, we need to continue to build on that lead so we don't get overtaken. And one of my buddies who still has a photography business actually made this statement to me when I asked him years ago about digital photography, and he said, I'll never use it in my business. The quality's just not there. Well, today, 98, 99% of his business is digital photography. Weddings, other events. That's what people are okay with. And that's what he can deliver very quickly using existing technologies. So we need to remember that that model, what, so what, now what, is critical. Because the what's important, what are we focusing on, determines what we believe the answer to the so what is, and then determines the decisions we're going to make in terms of the now what. So Kodak's criteria was, man, chemical photography is our lifeblood. We're going to focus on it because this digital photography is only going to be a small market, if that. Well, they were wrong. If you don't know, typically new technologies aren't competitive with old technologies at first. But as the technology gets better, it can in many cases overtake the old technology. So we need to be aware of that when we're making decisions, particularly those that revolve around some new technology. Another example, but different, is the example of General Motors, a company I used to work at, and we called it at the time Generous Motors. Great place to work at. Probably is today. The critical decision that was made at General Motors was, for various reasons, some may be true, some may be not so true, is we can't compete with Japanese automakers in terms of making small cars. Now, this is one of the largest companies in the world with some of the smartest engineers and scientists in the world. And I simply, having worked there, don't believe if the leadership commitment was to making small, high-quality, fuel-efficient cars at a profit, that it could not be done at General Motors. But that was their what? Their view, their criteria, which narrowed the alternatives, which caused them to mostly seed the market, allow the Japanese to have that part of the market, because we're going to make money on big cars and trucks. And we're going to make a lot of money, by the way. Well, when the first energy crisis hit in the early 70s, about 1971, people just swarmed to these small fuel-efficient cars. And the die was set. The Japanese were able to grow fairly quickly and profitably, and then they moved up market. Toyota, Lexus, Nissan, Infiniti, as well as others. And when they moved into those luxury brands, they moved into larger cars. And then lastly, they moved into trucks. And then we saw bankruptcies in the American automobile manufacturing industry. We saw other companies like Chrysler captured, taken over by other companies, no longer being independent. We saw AMC cease to exist. They were consumed by other companies. So those decisions are impactful, but they start with the criteria we use, the focus we use to make decisions. Another example is McDonald's. McDonald's was not founded by Ray Kroc. It was founded by the McDonald brothers. The McDonald brothers, due in part to previous failures or problems they had in business, had a laser focus on quality and consistency, and they were very risk averse. And in comes this guy who's willing to take a risk in spite of his own failures previously in business. A lot of complexities in this story, but basically the McDonald brothers decided this is getting too difficult. There were a number of decisions that were made that caused them to sell their share of the business for literally pennies on the dollar, maybe percentages of pennies. And the rest is history. McDonald's, one of the biggest, if not the biggest franchisor in the world, and dominating the fast food business around the world, not just in the United States, with thousands of locations. So that decision, based in part on the McDonald's brothers' view of risk and consistency and quality, caused them to make a decision that literally cost them millions and millions of dollars. Is that of McDonald's. McDonald's was not founded by Ray Kroc. It was actually founded by the McDonald brothers. The McDonald brothers, as well as Ray Kroc, had some business failures before McDonald's. But what they both knew that, wow, this is a great upcoming business. The McDonald brothers, though, risk averse, laser focused on quality and consistency, while Ray Kroc saw this thing is huge. We can build this thing into hundreds, if not thousands, of fast food restaurants around the country and eventually around the world. That difference in vision, along with some other complexities, allowed the McDonald brothers to make a decision to sell their share for literally pennies or even percentages of pennies on the dollar to Ray Kroc, thinking if they stayed with him on this journey, if they stayed with him on this path, it would eventually result in failure and a loss of a lot of money. So their what was so different from Ray Kroc's what that they were willing to disengage because of that. So you can see how that decision about what's important and what to focus on can lead to decisions in the now what that aren't necessarily in your best interest. So now when you look at some individual decisions, think about marriages, think about job changes, think about the school you select if you decide you want to go to a university. Think about deciding whether or not you want to get a master's degree or not. Think about quitting and starting your own business or not. All of these decisions are hugely impactful. So one of the things we need to consider when we think about the what is how much time should we take before we make the decision? How much information should we gather? What type of information should we gather? And how will this decision impact us as well as other stakeholders, those around us, our family, our friends? If we're talking about organizational decisions, other divisions, other organizations in the company, the workforce, our clients, our customers. That's why decisions are so complex. But that's why we need to have a structured place, a structured process to be able to make these decisions that are timely, that are high quality, and that are forward looking. One of the things we need to consider as we move through this webinar are the decision-making skills that are needed to be a good decision maker. So there are several that I want you to consider. Are you able to identify critical factors that will affect the outcome of decisions you're making? What's important? What's not important? What will likely be an outcome or a significant impact if you make this decision? You want to be able to evaluate options and alternatives accurately and establish priorities as appropriate. Are you able to anticipate the outcome, the cause and effect, and see some of the logical consequences related to your decisions? Are you able to navigate risk and uncertainty? This is an area that really causes problems for a lot of people when they're trying to make decisions. How much risk is there really? How do I make a decision when I'm uncertain of the outcome? When I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month? And are you able to reason well in the context requiring quantitative analysis? Now, as I mentioned, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about things like return on investment or Lean Six Sigma or those things. But it's important that you understand how to use these tools when appropriate and use them in a way that supports your decision but doesn't make the decision for you. Now I want to talk about a basic decision-making process you can use for all decisions. Now when we walk through these steps, one of the things you need to know, in some cases, you can walk through these steps fairly quickly and make a decision, even as you're having a discussion across a table or desk with another person or a group of people. In some cases, each of these steps may take a while. So one of the things about making good decisions is to understand what the word timeliness means based on a particular decision. The first step in the process that we're going to use is to establish a positive decision-making culture or environment. In other words, how are decisions made? How are people involved or not? This culture will go a long way to determining how good your decisions are based on the information you're able to gather from all stakeholders, employees, customers, the community that you're involved in, suppliers, etc. So what are some of the things that you need to do? Think about a meeting where people seem to be discussing different issues. Then you've seen what happens when that decision-making environment has not been established. It's critical, it's important that everyone in that meeting or in that organization or in that school or in that not-for-profit understands what's important, what the issues are, before they're asked to make decisions or to provide input for decisions. So that means agreeing upon an objective, making sure the right issue is being discussed, agreeing on a process to move the decision forward, addressing key interpersonal considerations at the very beginning. Think about the Kodak example. Some leaders are intimately involved with financial considerations if they're going to move away from or divide their attention from chemical photography, for instance. And it doesn't mean, I want to make it clear, it doesn't mean these were bad people or not smart people. They likely were very smart, very good managers. But there's bias for all of us, and some of that is unconscious, and we need to make sure we understand that and get that out in the open as quickly as possible. We talked about stakeholders. Have you included all of them? Talk about who they are and what they might think of any path or alternative we might take. Are they involved? And if they're involved, do they agree to respect one another and engage in open and honest discussion? Now, anybody who works in an office environment or a large company environment, even a medium company, maybe even a small company, you understand office politics. So how do we get past those and establish an environment that involves all, that's inclusive, that allows for open and honest discussion, and make sure that you aren't making decisions based simply or mostly on the strongest opinions in the room? Because if you are, you run a high risk of not understanding or considering some of the potentially best solutions available. One of the tools I would like to discuss is the Eisenhower Matrix. And that matrix is a simple 2x2 matrix where if you look across the top, you're asking yourself, is the decision urgent and important, or not urgent but important? If it's urgent and important, we need to do something. We need to make a decision. I mean, it really captures those two possibilities. If it's not urgent but important, we need to plan. See, this is where, hey, this is important. Well, we don't need to make a decision today. We need to plan for a decision. If the decision is urgent but not important, as a leader, understanding you can't do everything, you need to delegate it to the appropriate person or team or organizational entity as appropriate. And then finally, if it's not urgent and not important, why are you spending time on it? Maybe you should just simply ignore it. Now, we need to understand that typically, in many cases, decisions or problems or issues tend to move from one of these blocks or more. So for instance, if you have a decision that's not urgent but important and you do nothing, at some point it will move into the urgent and important category, and then you need to do something immediately. And this is what we see often that causes problems, where we've not placed decisions in the appropriate category so we know what to do with them right now. Urgent but not important, delegate it. Not urgent but important, plan. Put some time frame on it. urgent and important. We need to do something now. We need to make a decision immediately, whatever that immediacy is. So this is a good way to look at all decisions. If you're having a planning meeting, I would say at some point you want to use this matrix or something like it to place those strategic decisions that you need to make or your organization needs to make. So what might that be? You're a leader in an oil company and there's a spill on the Alaskan continent or the Alaskan state. That's urgent and important. You need to make a decision now. However, if you are running an oil company where you're moving oil by ship, you already know that the possibility of an accident, which includes a spill, is possible. So before the spill happens, there's no urgency, but it's certainly important that you plan. And all too often we see, even in large organizations, they don't plan for the worst. They assume, in many cases, that can never happen to us because we have all these great rules in place and plans and structures that make sure that won't happen. And that's great. You absolutely should have that, and it's part of your plan. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't also plan for the worst. I do want to say another word about complex decisions and what we ought to be thinking about. What is a complex decision? Well, there are several factors that we can look at. One is uncertainty. Many facts are just simply unknown or unpredictable. Complexity. There may be many interrelated factors that need to be considered. And as we stack these interrelated factors on top of each other, they can make that decision seem even more complex. So we need to have a way of breaking that down, still making sure we understand the interrelationships, but we can break that down into simpler decisions that allow us to deal with complexity. High risk consequences. Oil spills, airplane crashes, bridge failures, very high risk. So the impacts of any decision you made will have great significance. Dollars, human life, bad press, whatever the case may be. Alternatives. There may be various alternatives, but each of them are likely to have their own set of uncertainties and consequences. So we'll need to weigh those. And that's certainly not easy. And then another area where in many cases we tend to fall down is looking at interpersonal issues. Being able to predict and understand how different people, different stakeholders will react to these decisions. That's an important activity. And you wonder sometimes, I can remember instances where a large company made a decision to negotiate with one or more unions for some rollbacks, either in salaries or benefits or job rules, because we're really struggling to make a lot of money. We're not making as much money as we used to, and we need to make some of these cutbacks. Hopefully they'll be temporary, but we need to make them in order to remain successful. And then the negotiation happens. They get some of these rollbacks that they asked for, and then they immediately, or almost immediately, announce significant raises for senior leaders in the organization. So how do you think the union will react to that decision? So we need to plan for that. Again, it doesn't mean that that wasn't the right decision, but understand what that will mean. Now, when you look at international politics, think about how complex those decisions are. anything from a country like the United States providing money to different countries who on Monday may be an ally, and on Tuesday they may seem like an enemy. While at the same time, there are individuals citizens of the United States who are unemployed or underemployed. So these decisions are critically consequential, but they're also complex. So we need to know how to deal with those. Another factor to make sure we understand in terms of creating organizational decision making that is positive is culture and ethics. So culture is the way in which a group of people solves problems. North American culture stresses decisiveness, speed, and the individual selection of alternatives. Other cultures pay much less emphasis on individual choice than on developing implementations to solve problems. The most important aspect, though, of culture on decision making concerns issues related to status problems in the firm. In other words, how does the leader react to ethics? How does the leader react to risk? How does the leader react to recommendations or ethical concerns? So we need to keep that in mind and understand how we deal with risk, how we deal with ethics, how we deal with culture. So when talking about ethics, what is an ethical dilemma? It's a situation where a person must decide whether or not to do something, even though it may be personally or organizationally beneficial. It may be considered unethical and perhaps illegal. Now, ethical decisions or dilemmas are often associated with risk and uncertainty. So that's what we want to deal with. How do we make decisions when there's lots of risk or lots of uncertainty? But it's also associated with non-routine problem situations. So we need to understand both of those, and one of the things that we can do is to create an ethical decision-making checklist. One, is my action legal? If you're not sure, you need to ask. If you think it might be legal, then there's probably a problem with it. Is it right? Now, it may be legal, but not really right. And unfortunately, dealing with things that aren't right tends to slide into the illegal aspect. And it can also create many problems, even if it is legal, with trust, with engagement, with motivation of employees or customers or suppliers. Is it beneficial? And then a couple things we need to think about, and some people call this the 60 minutes or the newspaper rule. How would I feel if my family found out about my decision? How would I feel if I was being interviewed or talked about on 60 Minutes? What if my decision, along with my picture, was printed in the local newspaper? If you have concerns about people finding out about a decision you made, especially outside of the organization, but maybe even inside, then you're probably not on the right track. Your ethical compass is probably telling you, don't do it. So what are some of the things you can do to make sure you're improving the culture and the ethics of decision making in your organization? You can develop a code of ethics and follow it. Establish specific procedures for reporting ethical violations. Make sure you involve employees in identifying ethical issues. Monitor ethical performance. There are ways to do that. Reward ethical behavior. You hear about rewards for getting the job done, getting it under budget, safely, and so forth, but not often about rewards for ethical behavior. And then publicize it. And make sure you publicize it in a way where you say, hey, we rewarded Joe because of this incident of ethical behavior that he was involved in. So we need to make sure when we're establishing this positive environment, this positive culture of decision making, we're not forgetting about the culture of our organization and about ethics. So the next step in this process is to generate possible solutions. And we just need to make sure when we're doing this that we're inclusive, that we make sure we get values and opinions from different stakeholders in different parts of the organization, so we have a very robust set of alternatives. We do not want to sit, for instance, in a planning meeting and have somebody say, and typically this will be the leader of that group, we're not going to deal with that, with no explanation. Now, if it's a risk-averse organization, the explanation may be, that's too risky. And here's why it is. But I would rather go forth with generating alternatives without any caveats, without any restrictions, without any judgment regarding their appropriateness or how good they are. Let's look at a set of alternatives. And let's make sure we can categorize them in a manner which allows us to be able to say we've canvassed the entire set of potential alternatives based on our authority. Now, for instance, if you're a West Coast affiliate of a large company and you know one of the alternatives that you would like to pursue has already been determined to not be feasible or not to be allowed or something like that, you know that there's some more work you need to do before you even seriously consider that alternative. But as much as possible, be non-judgmental. Allow all alternatives to exist. And there's two reasons for this. One, you don't want to leave anything out. And two, you don't want to leave something out that while it may seem like it's not feasible or appropriate or possible, maybe by allowing the person to explain what they mean, you might see a glimmer of hope or light. You might also allow that person to be trained on why the thinking that they had that allowed them to arrive at that particular recommendation is not feasible, so then they can have better focus in the future and thus make better recommendations. When we start to identify alternatives or recommendations or solutions that we're going to select in terms of our decision making, we need to make sure we consider two types of thinking: vertical thinking and lateral thinking. So what are those? Well, vertical thinking is basing your thought processes on prior knowledge and experience. It's also using logic that relates only to our immediate experience. And finally, constraining our creativity and ability to solve problems. So see, that's a limited way of looking at or thinking about problems and problem solutions. Lateral thinking, on the other hand, is changing the orientation and perception. Again, going back to Steve Jobs as an example, we're going to change our orientation to believing that we have to compete with every electronics company in every area, to constraining our thinking to 4 areas where we can be number one, where we can create an environment that says the products that we deliver are among the best versus we deliver all products and services, or most. Or if we're General Motors, we don't use vertical thinking to say, well, our experience with small cars is we don't make much money on them anyway, and we're struggling to make high quality vehicles because we're trying to cut costs. So we need to change our orientation and perception about them. As a matter of fact, thinking about the car industry, one of the reasons Tesla has been so successful so far is their orientation and perception about automobiles is totally different from what you see with most automotive manufacturers. Why? Because one of the critical parts of making a good quality car is making sure you have a high quality engine and transmission. But in an electric car, you're not using that internal combustion engine or diesel engine. So that capability is not required. So that's why even companies like Apple, there continues to be rumors that they're going to make an electric car. Well, the skills and abilities needed for making an electric car are different in many ways from making a car with an internal combustion engine. So that way we can generate new ideas and visions to solve problems versus only considering approaches that really are vertical thinking approaches. So, vertical thinking, to summarize, is selective. And remember, when we're generating alternatives, we don't want to be selective. You can only reach a conclusion by a valid series of steps in vertical thinking. Lateral thinking, however, is generative. That type of thinking actually generates more ideas because it builds upon ideas that others have thought about. So really you want to use both, because vertical thinking helps you develop the ideas that can be generated by lateral thinking. The next step in this process is to check using predetermined criteria. Why predetermined? Because otherwise you are likely to fall into a trap of thinking, well, this looks good, I like it, I'm going to pick it. That's where you allow bias to seep in. That's where you allow yourself not to listen to feedback that you're getting from others. So set that criteria up right at the beginning. Does it fit with my culture? Does it fit with the risk that I'm willing to take or my organization is willing to take? Is it ethical? Is it legal? All of those criteria need to be determined up front. The next step in the decision-making process is to communicate. Now that you've made a decision, you need to communicate it, share your reasons why, and thus start the implementation process. One of my favorite stories, when I was starting my MBA program, the organization's leaders went on a 3-day offsite and they created a strategic plan. It was a booklet about this thick. And it was actually pretty good. Now, since we were at a point in my MBA program where we were talking about strategy and strategic planning, I was interested in what they had done. I wanted to learn more. And I remember being told that this was close hold. We can't share it. And I remember saying, well, can I look at it in your office? So, you know, in case he was concerned that I might copy something or take something. And he said, what don't you understand about no? Yes, sir. Several years later, I gotten a couple promotions, and I was in this office of this leader who had now retired. And I went in on a Saturday to clean up things and move my things into that office. And I stopped because there was the book, this strategic plan. And I start going through this thing. And I never got through the whole thing. The disappointment was not that it was good or bad, was that there was nothing secret or close hold about it. If you don't communicate your vision, if you don't communicate your decision, how do you get it done? So this is an important part of implementing and making something happen. I'm sure people have thought, myself included, well, I made the decision, why isn't more happening? Because this is where you have to act. This is where you prepare in the previous steps for setting up the organization to be in a position for action. And part of creating that position is communicating your decision, what you want to happen, and how you want it to be implemented. The final step is to reflect. What happened? I'm confronted with a problem. I went through the steps to generate alternatives. I chose one or two, whatever is appropriate. I've started the implementation process in part by communicating what's required. And now I want to look back and ask myself, where can I do a better job with those steps? Did I miss anything? If things are working well, what was most important in making those actions work well? If they're not working so well, what can I change or adjust? And then using continuous improvement, continuous learning, continue to refine your process. These steps that we talked about are macro level steps, but how you choose to adjust them or utilize them for your benefit is important to your learning and growth as a leader. So as we start to close out this webinar, there are 6 skills or activities that I think are important for you to work on or continue to improve on. The first of these is creating a positive environment. You want to create an environment around you, both personally and professionally, that allows others to provide ideas, to tell you if they think you're wrong, to be willing and able to propose ideas that in many cases might be outside the box, but that may provide a way for you to look at other alternatives that you might not otherwise look at. Number 2, even though it is important to understand and be able to use decision-making tools, you need to be able and willing to use judgment, intuition, creativity, and experience to help you in making decisions. Now that's the art of decision making. Number 3 is the science of decision making, which is utilizing financial tools, process improvement tools, and others to support your decision. It's important to understand, though, that you don't want to eliminate one or the other and only lean on the science of decision making or the art of decision making. You want to use all tools that are available to you. And those tools are both qualitative, the art, and quantitative, the science of decision making. The 4th area we want to consider is timeliness. And that doesn't necessarily mean fast. It means as fast as is appropriate. If we have time, we want to spend some time talking to teammates, to clients, to folks from other parts of the organization as appropriate in order to get the best information needed to make a good decision. If it's an urgent decision and we don't have time, we're going to have to use other tools, our experience, our judgment, our intuition. One of the tools that I would recommend is one we talked about earlier, and that's the Eisenhower model. That's a very good tool to use when you want to ask yourself, how quickly do I need to make this decision, and how important is it? The fifth area we want to look at is bias, both organizational and personal. Now, bias is just a fact of life. It's part of the human condition. And for that reason, it's one of the webinars that we'll be discussing in the future, particularly unconscious bias. But there are things that we can do to, number one, identify these biases, and number two, mitigate or eliminate them. One of those tools leads us to our sixth area that we want to consider for improvement, and that's reflection. Take time to reflect on the decisions you have made. What happened? What was the outcome? Was it good or was it bad? Are there things you forgot to consider? Are there mistakes that you've made along the way? Now, as we mentioned earlier, good decisions can sometimes lead to results that aren't necessarily positive. And on the other hand, bad decisions can result in positive outcomes. We got lucky, or everything just fell into place for whatever reason. But what we want to do at the end is reflect on how we make decisions and ask ourselves, can we do a better job in one or more areas? That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all for your attention. Good luck, and hopefully you can be a better decision maker in the future. Thank you. I see you.